So fantastic. What a great session. And it was such a fun dialogue. Um, we want to open it up right now to our attendees to hit us up with any kind of questions that you might have right now based on it off of that session. Certainly want to open it up. But one of the first questions, and I actually had wanted to ask it on the panel, but one of the, while this is the Office 365 summit, one of the more obvious questions that come out of this is, well, what about Azure? So maybe I'm using Azure for my identity, maybe I'm using Azure for some other service. How does this kind of thinking, how does this structure fit in with my Azure infrastructure or PaaS as a service? So that was a question that I actually had. So, let me start with Bob. Bob, I think you're on right now. You want to kind of address how this kind of framework would work towards Azure as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned in my session, right, this is just sort of a thought process, right? It's not, and yes, we have produced documents and guidance, already for Office 365 and some other things already produced, but the process is exactly the same for Azure or really anything else, right? The idea is I need to understand, where the intersection of this technology and my security, compliance, governance needs are, right? Capture those, figure out, what do I need to do to make that happen? And sort of walk through that same cycle, right? Hey, assign people to own them, write up if there are any service descriptions. Now it's a little bit different, from an audience perspective with Azure. I'm not really writing, broad end user like capabilities of Azure and those kinds of documents. It's more around, hey, here are the decisions we made as an IT organization about what templates are, or some of those other things. I think, Travis, you've done a bunch of this, so when we get into the details, I'd like you to hop in on that, but just wrap it all around to assigning to somebody, creating the same governance scenarios, right, that we talked about for Office 365, and then have it come full circle. Because, by the way, last time I checked, Azure has changed equally as much as Office 365 has over the last couple of years. Travis, I know you've done a bunch of stuff out on the West Coast on this, so maybe you have some things to add.
Absolutely, Bob. So, the approach that you're talking about, where it's kind of you're looking at it more from that corporate perspective or the executive perspective. I look at it more from an infrastructure and a management security from the IT side, or who's actually going to be turning the nuts and bolts on this thing. So normally the approach that I take is a tops down, very similar to like you would run Active Directory, where you have your enterprise administrators, your domain admins. You can do the same thing within the Azure infrastructure as well. As you create your tenants, where you're actually spinning up VMs and SQL databases, whatever the case may be, you can still apply that same management and governance structure around that. So who gets access to what, your naming conventions, all of that still applies. So any processes that you have in place now on premises for management, your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you can continue to apply that in Azure IaaS and PaaS.
Terrific. So we definitely can apply, this level of thinking and this type of paradigm to Azure, and that's great. And again, Azure is a critical component of an Office 365 deployment, especially if a customer is looking at using and leveraging resilient identity. And there's also a notion nowadays as well about, potentially backing up things like OneDrive for Business and other things to address, deleted users and end users, and kind of sticking some of those types of things in Azure as well. So Dave, I had another question come in, and I think this is perfectly directed towards you. What kind of questions, having been a former C-level person yourself, what kind of questions do you think C-level folks that are attending this should be asking themselves and their teams as it relates to the top questions they should be asking as they put together a governance, security, compliance model?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. I think that from my perspective, the questions that C-level folks should be asking of their teams and of their partners is, guide me to understand what's new, what's changed, what's going to cause my resources to change the way in which they work today, what happens to the traditional job descriptions of your messaging team, your Active Directory team when they begin to start looking at embracing cloud services. Governance and building service descriptions are helpful from an end user perspective and ensuring that you kind of lay out the framework for what the services, these new services can offer. But I think C-level, especially on the technology side, need to understand is, how does my organization change? How do we need to adapt in order to ensure that we're managing this greenfield service that's coming, that we're planning to deliver to our end users? And how can we ensure that we're agile in adopting new technologies? And as we said in the session, be careful not to just simply go to the red lever mode, but rather really think thoughtfully about and pragmatically about the way in which these services can help improve productivity, collaboration capabilities.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So the next question that I have come in here is customers, and this is not new to us, are struggling at times staying up to date with the latest and when these things are going to be rolling out. In particular, they hear about something rolling out in the commercial cloud, but the government cloud. So I wonder if any of you guys have some best practices or guidance for our customers on sort of the best way to stay up to date with some of the new services and features of Office 365.
You want to start, Travis, and then I'll hop in after you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, personally, like I subscribe to Yammer feeds in newsletters and, direct correspondence from, the Microsoft field engineers, those types of things. But also, a lot of these updates are available, on the Azure portal itself, but also within the Azure feature sites that provide that Azure roadmap of, what's going to be new for PaaS, what features are we adding to, the Azure SQL, what new VMs are coming out, those types of things. And if you're not sure, you can always engage, folks like Planet to come in and help educate you on that as well.
Great. Bob, Dave, have anything you want to add to that? Dave, I'm sorry, we seem to have dropped Bob real quick, but Dave, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to stay up to date is to stay in touch with your Microsoft account team and make sure that they're supportive and active and engaged, as well as with your primary partner helping you with this stuff. Typically, both Microsoft and Microsoft's partners have a pretty good insight as to what's coming down the pike. Oftentimes have information that may not be publicly available. So I would say, if you leverage your partners and the Microsoft team, you'll be pretty good in terms of keeping up to date.
Yeah, I want to add too, there are actually some pretty good podcasts there as well that go over the releases. There's a couple that I subscribe to as well from Microsoft. They have a couple pretty interesting podcasts that outline the updates at a high level on a monthly basis, and that's one of the ways that I stay in touch for sure. And then, of course, Microsoft has their site for this, but the reality is it's a challenge. It's a ton of information. In many respects, it's actually way too much information. And Bob, I'm sure you're smiling at this because one of the things that I know we do for our customers is really kind of try to cut the wheat from the chaff there. Want to address that, Bob?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. So, and by the way, apologize for dropping for a second. The power actually went out in my house for about 30 seconds.
It's live TV, Bob. It's live TV.
I'm broadcasting over my phone right now. So I did miss a couple of seconds there. So if you could just really quickly re-tee me up to know what.
Yeah, so I was talking about some of the resources that Microsoft offers themselves for subscribers of Office 365 to stay up to date, and how it's just in some cases way too much information, so you kind of have to pare it down and focus it.
Right. Yep. So yeah, I mean, it's a couple. There's a couple of interesting paradigms at work. So one of the things that I think is beneficial to our government customers, which of course is pretty much the only people on this particular summit, is that you do have for almost every feature you have some lead time between when it shows up and gets discussed and talked about and poked and prodded in the commercial enterprise tenant, right, to when it shows up in the government tenant, right? So So, I think that while I think it would be great for our customers to be like Travis and I, which, inundate ourselves with all of this material, the biggest challenge, right, is trying to see, where does this raise on the things I care about today list, right? I mean, that's really the biggest challenge. And, there's obviously, there's a number of resources you can leverage on. It is one of the things at Planet, for instance, that you leverage our trusted advisor with our Vault 365 service to help sort of weed through, as well as in our You Already Own It program that many of our customers, probably many that are on this call, are members of, through our monthly webcasts and things like that to try to help sort of boil this down. But it definitely is overwhelming, right? We need to, there are literally a dozen blog posts every other day about something changing, altering, affecting, whatever in Office 365. And they don't always, it's not always easy to determine that, in fact, it matters to you, right? This is something I need to care about, right? So, we really have sort of tailored a big part of what we do at Planet to try to help customers with this exact scenario.
Okay, terrific. And I want to encourage anybody, any of the attendees, please use the Q&A button on the bottom if you have any questions that you want to ask. This question is actually mine for the panel. We discussed a lot, sort of the analyze, deploy, but in the context of new features and new functionality, just talk a little bit, if the panel could, both from a technical perspective as well as from a service description perspective and a governance perspective, how it is that we should be, how regularly should we be looking at this? How regularly should we be updating our governance operational documents? Understanding that we have customers and attendees here from all sizes and shapes of government with all sorts of different compliance requirements, but I think some kind of best practices there might be helpful.
I can go ahead and kick that off. So, and I'll address the technical and the operations perspective. So one of the things I like to do is create like an operations checklist where you do a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly type review of, what processes are associated with that, whether it comes to the ticketing system, server monitoring, disk space monitoring, alerting, whatever the case may be. Look at your processes associated with that and then review and see, is it still up to date? Is there a new feature that's within Azure, IaaS and PaaS, or Office 365 that can help elevate the type of insight that you have within your environment? Again, just taking that time to review what you have in place and seeing if any of the new features align with that.
Yeah, and Steve, I would add to that and say that, the answer to that question is going to be slightly different as you're working through your initial migrations, right? Because most customers are beginning to look at migrating an initial service, maybe a couple of services, a set of core services, and that is going to require some review as you're migrating and adjusting to whether you're sending it, you're supporting a single agency or a county or city versus managing multiple agencies within the executive branch of a state government. There may be more frequent governance discussions as issues are brought to your attention from your customers about different capabilities. But as you begin to spin down your migration and move into more of a maintenance mode, then you can get into, I think, a more regular, rhythm of governance meetings, whether that be monthly or even quarterly. While we indicate that Microsoft is updating the service on a fairly regular basis, to Bob's point, those updates are managed pretty well and they're communicated pretty well. So I don't see a need for a hypersensitive set of regular meetings, but it's going to be different at the beginning as you're getting your feet wet and deploying the services, and then hopefully it gets into more of a regular rhythm.
Yeah, and I just have one other thing to add. I think when we were initially sort of putting together the vision for this, when we talked about, the governance board, et cetera, I think initially the thought was this was going to be, down level agencies, departments, specific users saying, hey, I want to be able to do something that's not enabled today. can you turn it on? And, you know, obviously that's going to be there for the life of the solution. But I also think it's for the technologists within central IT to also say, hey, here are things coming on the horizon feature wise, right? Solutions wise. There's, you know, there's a new product. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. There was no such thing as groups, right? There's, you know, right now in the government tenant, you know, as much hoopla as there is around teams, right? It's still actually not there yet, right? So, you know, if you're not following it, right, you don't even know that this feature exists. And oh, by the way, it's coming, you know, soon. Exactly when is yet to be determined, but you know, it's coming soon, and it's game changing, right? So you need to start thinking about when, you know, bring that to what are we going to do when this comes out? What is our strategy? Let's start thinking about how we dissect it. We can go to a commercial tenant and look at what it does and understand, right?
That's great, guys. Thank you so much. Just want to give it a few seconds to see if there's any other questions and answers that want to come in. While I do that, let's tidy up a little bit. Great session, guys. Really appreciate it. So we will have a break now until 11:15. So please come back and join us at 11:15. The next session is going to be time to modernize your traditional phone system to the cloud. And are we there yet? And we're going to find out if we're there at 11:15. On the board, you see the email addresses of the panel. Feel free to reach out to any of us about any questions that you might have. We might have one more question come in. Oh, how many participants in attendance today? We have over about 120 or so people on right now. Thank you for the question. Okay, terrific. We will see hopefully everybody back at 11:15. Time to modernize your traditional phone systems. This is something you're going to want to know, especially if you're talking to your Microsoft team members around the M365 E5 SKU. Thank you.